Hello, students. This is Professor Bowen here with some comments on our Week 6 discussion, which, if you'll recall, had to do with medieval Islamic medicine and, in particular, this concept of the retrospectoscope. We had a lot of things to say about the retrospectoscope. I thought there was some good back and forth in our discussion. Most of us acknowledged that if used improperly, this is a tool that can actually do violence to the past because it can make us rather ignorant of the way that past generations conceptualized and dealt with illness. It's really important to learn about how our ancestors viewed and explained the diseases that they confronted, even if we disagree with those views and explanations. As historians, one of our top goals is to get inside the heads of the people that we're studying, because if we can do this, we can really unlock lots of things, like why people act the way they do. And this is an essential part of historical inquiry. As the medical historian Iona McCleary has put it, quote, "If we want to understand what health and illness meant for past sufferers, we have to accept their labels, not impose ours." While recognizing this, in last week's discussions, a lot of us nevertheless made the argument that the retrospectoscope has definite value and argued that it should not be thrown away. Among other things, we said that the retrospectoscope is a brilliant method, that it's a sufficient tool, and that it gives us an important perspective on past diseases. Along with this, some of us asked if people who use the retrospectoscope believe that pre-modern explanations of illness are quote-unquote wrong. This is a really great question. It gets at something that is really central to the problems that historians face. We're always confronting this dilemma. Are we trying to reconstruct the world as past peoples perceived it? Or are we trying to find out what really happened? Those who make use of the retrospectoscope put themselves in the latter camp. Without entirely dismissing the opinions of the people that they study, they nevertheless believe that the tools of modern science can give us a better understanding of the history of health and disease. As the historian Dionysius Stathakopoulos puts it, quote, "What was invisible to the peoples of the past need not remain invisible for us as well." Anthropologists have given us a language for talking about these two different approaches. To use their terminology, those who draw upon modern knowledge and techniques when investigating the past are taking an etic approach, and those who adopt the categories and concepts used by the historical actors they study are taking an emic approach, so etic and emic. For much of the 1980s and 1990s, partisans of these emic and etic approaches in medical history were kind of at war with each other. Those in favor of emic methodologies argued that we can't really know what diseases people in the past really suffered from because the only primary sources that we have are texts, and these are documents that don't do anything aside from describing people's symptoms and detail their physical and mental and emotional sufferings. Given the limitations of our source base, it seemed historians were beholden to the conceptual categories being created and utilized in these written texts. Using these materials to try to create a real, unfiltered past seemed foolish and irresponsible. But more recently, things have changed. Thanks to advances in microbiology and genetics, we now possess techniques that allow us to use more than written documents when investigating diseases of the past. In particular, we now have methods that allow us to capture and analyze ancient DNA, or aDNA, By aDNA, we mean genetic material from ancient skeletal remains. Extracting DNA from ancient human remains is quite difficult, but a major breakthrough came in 2004 when scientists developed a protein assay test that was shown to work quite well with historical samples. Since then, aDNA research has come a long way. Among other things, it's helped us determine, with complete certainty, what caused the Black Death of the mid-14th century, Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that causes bubonic plague. This research, I think, has helped culturally minded historians reconsider some of their previous scientific agnosticism. It has forced them to reevaluate the anti-retrospective diagnosis position. What if, for example, let's consider this, we're trying to write the medical history of a people or a society that left us no written documents to work with? What do we do? This could be the case for civilizations that lacked writing systems. It could also be the case for civilizations that were so thoroughly destroyed that all of their written records are non-existent today. If we took an emic approach, there would really be no way of producing an historical account of these vanished societies. If we have no other testimony of past people's sufferings than physical remains, does that mean we should throw up our hands and lament that no historical research can be conducted here? Or does it instead mean we embrace the retrospectoscope? Increasingly, I think historians are learning how valuable this tool can be. This research, importantly, does not really undermine the work of historians who prefer the emic approach. Instead, it gives them new avenues of investigation and new sites to apply their tools and methodologies to. To take the example of the Black Death, one of the things that aDNA research has revealed is that this pandemic originated on the Tibetan plateau somewhere in the 11th or the 12th century. So now, historians who study this part of the world, that is the eastern end of the Eurasian landmass, have new questions that they can ask of the historical texts and other cultural products they study. They can ask, for example, were there any references to a new disease or a mysterious illness that appeared from those who lived or traveled through this part of the world at that time? What light might the textual evidence shine on recent scientific findings regarding the Black Death's origins? This is an example of how the emic and the etic approaches can be combined in ways that benefit everyone. And so, to answer the question, no, these approaches are not inherently in conflict with each other. It's possible and productive to embrace and use both. Another question emerging from last week's discussion had to do with Ragab's book, The Medieval Islamic Hospital. If you'll recall, one of the things that Ragab argues in this book is that instead of being secular, modern institutions, they are sometimes presented as, medieval Islamic hospitals were actually profoundly sacred and religious and pietistic places. In our discussion, we focused largely on the architectural features of these buildings and on the motives of the rulers who funded their construction and gave them patronage. We also talked about the physical location of these hospitals within urban environments. We noted that their placement next to religious sites was done deliberately to underscore their spiritual significance. But what about what went on within these hospitals? Some of us were wondering about the kinds of diagnostic and therapeutic techniques practiced within these hospitals and about the experiences of patients. Was medicine based on the Quran, or was it more secular? This is a really, really great question, and I wanted to provide some additional information on it. So the physicians who worked in these bimaristans were educated doctors. In Ragab's book, we learn about lots of different hospital physicians and also their students who gained lots of valuable medical training in these hospitals. We know that hospital physicians read and lectured on the works of Hippocrates, Galen, Al-Razi, and in particular the canon of Ibn Sina. Lots of these hospitals were in urban locations, and doctors treated patients from all walks of life. But in terms of their actual interactions with these patients, we actually can't say that much because there are no surviving records that speak to clinical practices within these institutions. We don't have case files of individual patients, for example. So in the absence of this kind of evidence, historians like Ragab have to use other kinds of sources to try to figure out what was going on within these hospitals and what doctors were actually doing. Looking at other hospital records, for example, documents that talk about the kinds of medicinal substances and pharmacological products they contained, we can say that hospital practice, and this is one of the things that Ragab argues at least, he says that hospital practice was focused more on treatment with drugs rather than diet management or regimen. Ragab also looks at the educational aspects of these hospitals, and he concludes that on the basis of what doctors taught their students, clinical practice probably was based on 3 particular books. The first book of Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, a Hippocratic text called Aphorism, and a book by the doctor Hunan ibn Ishaq, which is called Questions on Medicine. These doctors also made great use of Al-Razi's writings. So, in an attempt to figure out how they diagnosed and treated patients, Ragab also makes use of Al-Razi's clinical notes. It's kind of a methodological sleight of hand. You don't have exact evidence of what was going on within these hospitals, but if you know that these doctors were following physicians like Al-Razi, perhaps you can say that their practices were similar. So in this respect, we might say that Islamic hospital physicians made use of quote-unquote scientific therapies. But we shouldn't overlook the fact that these were fundamentally pietistic sites with a largely charitable function. Within the hospital walls, doctors implemented a knowledge of 2 types, one that was natural and the other that was more religious. Prayer, for example, was a central element of hospital practice, as were recitations of Quranic verse. These and other acts of ritual piety were on full display within medieval Bimaristans. And, interestingly, there is some evidence to suggest that, with the passage of time, hospital practices became increasingly Islamicized. For example, in a 2013 article called Medicine for Muslims, historian Paulina Levica argues that Arabic medicine was intentionally Islamicized in the 13th century so as to help Islamic doctors better compete against Christian and Jewish practitioners who met with lots of success in their own practices and sometimes were more successful than Islamic physicians. Ragab's book doesn't really engage this claim, but he does point out that hospital doctors were people with religious concerns and with an interest in maintaining and strengthening Islamic institutions. And on that basis, we could conclude that a lot of what went on in terms of clinical practices was religious in nature. So it was kind of a mix. All right, I hope this helps clarify some of the further questions we had coming out of our discussion in week 6. I'm really looking forward to week 7 when we're going to talk about another medieval society, this Western Europe, and their medical practices and beliefs. Until then, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.